Yeah. What's your question?
I'm on Orkambi. I have cystic fibrosis, and I take Orkambi.
Oh,
it's a little over 20 grand a month. And
great drug.
It'd just be really interesting, to talk to somebody with your perspective on that, because I think what you talked about in the I can hear you. The therapeutic cost, because this is something that I'm going to have to take for the rest of my life, Yeah. And the cost per year is $259.
My friend died of cystic fibrosis when he was 19.
That's crazy. I'm doing
one of the reasons I got into the drug business.
Oh wow. Well,
I think Orkambi should be twice as expensive, actually.
Well, I guess we'll see how that plays out, but it is interesting, especially with how, I guess, the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation kind of set a new paradigm as far as those organizations are concerned with what they were able to sell those royalty rights for. Yep. I don't have the exact number offhand, but it was a pretty extraordinary amount. And they took a lot of flack up front because they invested a lot. As you know, a charity or charitable organization, they invested a lot. And if it had went the other way, it would have been a big gamble. But I was just curious about your thoughts on that. And did you ever have any thoughts? I'm sure you have, if you said your friend inspired you to take this path, about looking into the development of a cystic fibrosis drug, maybe?
So look, I have a lot to say on the subject. Like I said, one of my friends died of cystic fibrosis when he was 19. And without drugs like Kalydeco and Orkambi, people with cystic fibrosis, which is the largest genetic lethal illness, will continue to die. And I'm happy that you're on Orkambi, because now you have a fighting chance to survive a horrible, horrible illness. It's an expensive drug because it's hard to cure cystic fibrosis, and not many people have it, even though it's the largest genetic killer. And the company that developed it, Vertex, I think they should be showered with riches for the kid's name who died is named Ray. The point is that the company that made these drugs should be showered with riches. They should make more money than any other company, in my opinion.
Well, and one thing that you mentioned too, that it's a little bit of I heard you mention the word esoteric before about the pharmacy industry, but you said that your company operated a loss farm. Maybe the only reason I'm familiar with that is because of my familiarity with this drug. But Vertex, for instance, throughout their whole history has operated at a loss up until, and they may continue to do that, but they may break a profit in the coming years. But that's after 2 decades, I think, of their existence.
I'm so glad that you say that. I really appreciate your perspective as a patient who's on a rare disease drug. I mean, that is exactly what I've been trying to say to fools like William and some politicians that don't understand how this business works. And it is a business. And without it being a business, we wouldn't make drugs at all. Universities don't make drugs. Government doesn't make drugs. Drug companies make drugs. And I'm developing a drug for a rare disease called Canavan, and a rare disease called Lafora, a rare disease called Pecan, and several others. And these are diseases, by the way, that have a worse prognosis than cystic fibrosis. And unlike cystic fibrosis, there's no Vertex for these diseases. And you can imagine what it's like if you were born with a disease that didn't have a Vertex. Quite frankly, you may not be alive right now. And so there needs to be a profit incentive. And yeah, we raised the price on Daraprim by a lot, but the only person that's getting hurt is the Walmarts, the ExxonMobils, the Googles, the Citigroups, the JP Morgans, fat American profit, Fortune 500 companies that can kiss my ass, because I have a lot of kids that I care about that are dying of diseases that nobody cares about. And to make ends meet, yeah, Vertex charges 20 grand a month. I think they should charge 50 grand a month, because at the end of the day, no actual patient is paying. Your family probably doesn't pay for Orkambi, is my guess.
No, they don't. Neither do I.
Yeah, it's just foolish for people to think that rare disease patients have to pay out of their own pocket. $20,000 a month sounds like a lot of money until you realize how few people have these illnesses. They're so few and far between that it's very difficult for a drug company to turn a profit, as Vertex has struggled to turn a profit, as Turing has struggled to turn a profit, unless there are actual, high prices in place. So
you're exactly right.
Yeah, this poor fool William doesn't understand that. Like, yes, the price went up by 5,000%, but the price was so fucking low before we raised the price I don't know how old you are, Cameron.
I'm 24.
Yeah, I mean, that's, by the way, as you know, that's an age where a lot of people with CF pass away by now. And
yeah, and this was another instance, speaking with you tonight, generally when I've met people that know someone with cystic fibrosis, they always use the term had because those people have usually passed.
no, things have gotten a lot better for CF. Now the life expectancy is at 50. And with Orkambi, and Vertex has a whole pipeline full of brand new CF drugs that are coming out in the next 10, 20 years. So I think we'll have a cure for CF. And, I'm really proud of that. But there's 20,000 rare diseases, and there's no drug companies that care about them. So it has to be expensive. It has to be, it's just sort of the facts of the business. And I don't expect people to understand it. I don't care if people understand it. I care about the people I know who are dying of horrific, terrible rare diseases. You see my life. I sit here eating popcorn and drinking cherry Coke all day. I'm not taking the money and throwing big parties with it. I'm focused on science. I love science, and I'm really proud of Vertex. Like I've had some angry words with those guys, but sometimes I respect them a huge amount for what they've done to CF. They've single-handedly changed the world, and there are countries that don't want to pay for it.
There are, in fact, where I live at in Tennessee, it actually presents some new challenges with this drug. Generally, insurance companies are requiring a prior authorization to pay a claim, most are, but that the PA is simply dependent upon a patient meeting the FDA indication, meaning they have one of those approved genotypes, they're older than 12, they have stable liver testing, and I believe there may be one other metric, but I believe that's all the FDA indication covers. But now, with Tennessee was one of the last states to start covering that drug, and they didn't start covering it until the 1st of January, whereas it was released in mid-July of last year. But they did, and I think there may be one of the few states that did that, but they required the lung function to go up, or to be in between, I think, 40 and 90%, where if you were below that or above, which would technically be normal, you wouldn't need it, which some doctors were disappointed at. But one thing specific, I'm sure you've heard of, if you have any familiarity with Vertex at all, was the precursor to that drug, Kalydeco. With Vertex, you look at, and with their drug, or the drug I'm on, Orkambi, you look at 50% have the homozygous F508 mutation that I have, or about that. When you look at Kalydeco, only about 6% of CF patients had that. So it was even smaller. So, you have about 30 patients with CF in the U.S. You take 6% of that, and then what percentage of those 6% were over the age, the FDA indication for, say, Kalydeco, the prior drug? So, I mean,
can't make any money.
And Kalydeco was something that was, they tested that. I believe that's it gets complicated. I deal with so much medical stuff. Sometimes it gets jumbled. But, I do have an admiration for you actually putting the real storyline out there.
Thanks, man. At the end of the day, every politician in the world, every uneducated person that comes here and yells at me, like, the only thing that gives me the strength to take it all, and people ask me how I have the patience, is people like you. Because at the end of the day,
do you have what are your reservations about the drug application processes? I'm not as familiar with those as I am maybe, my own individual illness, but I know it's a pretty expansive, lengthy process, even for something that gets status as an orphan drug like Orkambi, whereas most drugs don't get that status. But what do you think overall for people who maybe, I know politically you said you're not a big fan of voting, or you don't vote, which I can respect either side of that, but for people who are maybe more involved politically or not politically, what can we do to further along that process to make the development of these drugs easier?
Well, I mean, there's a few things. The FDA is actually pretty good. It's probably the one part of the government that's run pretty well, I would say. And the only thing is sometimes they make you do these animal testing. That's, I think, a little too exhaustive for people who are really sick and they're dying. They don't have the time to wait to triple check if an animal can tolerate the drug well. And I think the FDA, there should be some animal testing, but the level of animal testing, so it's called toxicology, is a little too intense, I think, sometimes from FDA. And then from the perspective of pricing, I think this whole hullabaloo with Daraprim is a terrible thing for orphan drugs, because it's basically saying that people with toxoplasmosis should be treated differently from people with other diseases because it's so rare that all of a sudden they shouldn't have a medicine because there's only 2,000 people with toxoplasmosis. And to make this even a remotely profitable drug, we had to raise the price to what we did. And that, no, we shouldn't do that. But, well, then what happens to the people with toxoplasmosis? What happens to the people with cystic fibrosis? Yeah, we can complain about a price increase, but what about these dying people? They need a company that will back them and support them the same way Vertex has backed and supported the cystic fibrosis community with 2 wonderful life-saving drugs. Someone's got to back and support the toxoplasmosis. Someone's got to cause and back a few of the other rare diseases. So I think that, the pricing, helping people understand that orphan drugs need to be expensive, otherwise they just don't work. Like you said, for Kalydeco, I mean, that was hilarious. I mean, you had the G551D mutation, if I recall correctly.
Yes, that's it, exactly.
Where you had maybe 1,000 Americans with that mutation. That's even less than Daraprim. So, they made it so it was, $350,000, because otherwise they just said, how can we justify to our shareholders even spending the money on this drug? I mean, they're not a charity. Their shareholders would just as soon have them spend money on other things. And by the way, I happen to know there are 17 people who created Kalydeco. I happen to know 3 of them. I hired 3 of them.
Oh, wow.
And, yeah. So the backstory is actually Vertex was adamant about not continuing the cystic fibrosis program.
Well, what about this? With I heard you mention, that the drug was provided to patients who needed it through the patient assistance program, whatever the equivalent of that is within your own drugs corporation. But one thing with me, I was fortunate enough to be able to be provided the drug shortly after it was released through a separate patient assistance program that provides payment to patients who need it for a wide range of drugs. That was one of the more expensive ones that they probably offered to pay for, but it wasn't directly from the company. In my case, they really didn't have a comparable version of what, y'all offer with Daraprim. And part of that was, I think initially they realized, if we can't get, say, TennCare in Tennessee, which is Tennessee's Medicaid program, if we can't leverage them or wait it out, say 6 months till they agree to pay for it, then we don't have the opportunity to create drugs like this, because we can't, they essentially, they can give a certain amount of the drug away, but they have to get Medicaid programs to buy in. And it is even, I saw one girl mention, well, Obamacare subsidies, those plans, they could, I guess, through some means or another be purchasing Daraprim. But what she doesn't realize, if Medicaid programs and Medicare programs, a large percent of, health insurance beneficiaries are recipients of programs like that. Of course, something like Daraprim is really specific, but if they didn't get on board and agree to purchase into these drugs or to agree to provide them for the patients, they're part of, not necessarily the free market, but they're part of the market for these drugs, Yeah.
I mean, I think that drug companies should be allowed to make money because what they have at stake is way more than any other kind of company. And I think shaming a company for trying to make money is a little crazy. If you look at what that company does, and if they're doing it to provide for more research for that same illness, like if you look at Vertex, Kalydeco funded Orkambi's approval. So, like, the money from Thing A definitely helps Thing B. And if you go to Vertex's website, they do have 10 more cystic fibrosis drugs in development because, they're doing so well in cystic fibrosis, they want to keep going.
And I don't want to seem uninformed either. Not that I'm the most informed person, but I can say there is a program, and I did call about getting on it. It's called something, I don't know the exact term, but it's for compassionate something. Again, not exactly sure, but it's I didn't qualify for it. It wasn't necessarily just based on financial need. Of course, it has to be the need for the medicine, which is, you know, an obvious first requirement, but it was more based upon, was that patient at a last stage of the disease, and more based on compassion, which is a little bit different. Whereas you're prescribed a drug like with Daraprim, they're not you know, you already have HIV apparently with the toxoplasmosis. So it's more based on a financial need. So this drug was a little bit different in that regard. But
you know, it's funny because Daraprim is actually much cheaper than Orkambi or Kalydeco.
It is. So and what is, I don't know this, what is the average treatment dose? Or what do you say, what's your at?
It's so it's 40 days, twice a day. So it's 80 pills at $750, which is about $60,000. But that's, if you think about that for a second, so $60,000 is a pretty cheap orphan drug. Most of these orphan drugs, just like the one you take, is $300,000 or $250,000. But what's funny is, unlike Orkambi, where 80% of Orkambi is paid for by insurance, only 30% of Daraprim is paid for by insurance. So the actual total cost of Daraprim right now is about $25,000, which is, I mean, unbelievably low for an orphan drug. You know, an orphan drug, I mean, like you're saying, the one you take is 10 times more expensive. So Daraprim is a pretty, at $25,000 is what we realize per patient. I mean, that's a pretty small number that we're asking the world to pay for a life-saving medicine.
Well, there's a lot of it seems like in the population where you said a percentage of, you mentioned something to do with 80%. Was it, what did you say related to that 80%? I'm sorry. It may have passed by me.
Just real quick, so 80% of Orkambi is paid for by commercial insurance. But remember, for Orkambi, you got to take it every year.
Yeah.
So not only is it $250,000 now, it's $250,000 the next year, the next year, the next year, the next year.
Of course.
So it's going to be millions of dollars for one patient, whereas Daraprim's about $25,000 one time only for one patient. And our company spends a fortune on R&D, Olson. The company will spend, you know, tens of millions of dollars on R&D this year on brand new drug research. So $25,000 for a one-time cure is very reasonable relative to literally like $2 million of Orkambi. And as you know, Cameron, Orkambi's not a cure.
It's
in fact,
not.
A lot of people feel it's a pretty modest benefit.
It is modest, but such a modest benefit when you're talking about a disease like this can make such a huge difference. To give you an example, I was almost totally oxygen dependent around August 15th of this past year, almost totally. You know, I could get up and spend some time in another room, but I eventually, you know, had to come back in my room or have oxygen with me. And I didn't see myself ever being able to get away from that really, unless something, you know, new were to come out. What it allowed me to do, and I went into the drug, and I always take, you know, the approach, I want to be realistic about any expectations to where if something new comes out, because I've been hearing about these things for 10, 20, my whole life essentially, as long as I can remember. And, you know, nothing groundbreaking. New meds have come out. It's slowly, the lifespan's gotten longer, but nothing, you know, life-changing has really came to me. Maybe a accumulation of all the different meds together, but when this one came out, you know, again, I looked at it really, I'd rather be surprised than be disappointed, in other words. But I will say this has been absolutely life-changing. I have been able to completely pretty much forego use of oxygen. My lung function went up from 66, 67, which doesn't seem probably all that bad, especially knowing the friend that you had mentioned earlier.
It goes down fast, though. It goes down so fast.
Yeah, it's been below 50, and it does go down so fast. And I'm only 24, and I never thought I would be able to get back up to even, say, 75, 76%, which I had been at.
You crying.
Well, you know, when this happened, I was able to get it. I got it back up in, you know, recently, and it still is up at like 75%. But if you would have asked me in August of last year if it would be possible, I would tell you, you know, no matter what happened, there's no way that would happen unless, you know, a new therapy like this did come out. And I was able to lose 40 pounds. I had gained so much weight because I essentially couldn't do anything else but just focus on breathing. And when you can barely breathe, you know, you can't really focus. You're not that worried about what you're eating, you know. If you're overeating, it's not going to be your greatest concern if you can't breathe. Yeah. So, I mean, even my doctors have been amazed, and they're seeing that with a lot of patients. So even if you don't see it, you know, with the benefit of your friend, he obviously, you know, and I've not known other CF patients well because they don't encourage us to spend time with one another because of, you know, you know what I mean there. You can catch illnesses.
My friend had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma when she was 17, and she met all of her friends who were also cancer patients, and they all died. She was saved by a drug called Rituxan. She was in the phase 3 clinical trial. So, I mean, a lot of people whose lives have been saved by medicine, and for everyone else who's watching and they just kind of want to throw stones at it, it's a life or death thing. It's not a joke. It's not a game. These companies need to be healthy and survive. And, you know, Vertex or Cambi is not going to save many lives. It's going to forestall.
Yes, exactly. But that's significant. It's essentially
that's very important.
And life-changing to a lot of people, you know. Yeah. But you're exactly right with what you say. But I didn't see it, you know, this at August of last year, you know. I'm sitting there realistically thinking I'm losing, okay, at best, I'm losing 3, 4, 5% every year doing everything I'm supposed to do, being compliant with everything that I possibly can. You know, how long am I going to live? Well, if it can provide me 4 or 5 more years of stable life, not being totally dependent on oxygen, I mean, that's all the difference in the world. And Vertex is making so much money in Orkambi that they're going to make sure that there's going to be a better Orkambi in 1 or 2 years, 3 or 4 years. And one thing that I talked about with other people that you maybe can shed some light on too, where say the government or commercial insurances are spending a lot of money on drugs like Orkambi or Kalydeco. The hope is that it would save money in other places, like inpatients' hospital stays. For me, I was basically in the hospital every 2-3 months. If I was lucky, I could stay out that long. You go in the hospital and stay, you know, a 2-week visit, say 30 grand, you know, on average. And that's just average. With this, I was able to stay out, you know, almost 5 months. My goal is to get to 6 months, you know, but that is extremely significant. You know, if it costs $20,000, you know, every month, but say I forego several of those, you know, $30,000 hospital stays, that's huge.
Yeah, exactly.
And the government, they're not able to maybe directly take that into account as far as when they approve the drug. I'm talking about Medicaid or TennCare in Tennessee, but they do look at that. Each state's Medicaid program, when they go to approved treatments or put these on, you know, say Medicaid in Tennessee's formulary, they do look at things like that. So, hey, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. It was really nice. I won't make it last too long, but I really like what you're doing. I've seen negative caricatures of you throughout, you know, all the media, the left, the right media. They're demonizing you. And I really wish you the best of success. And is your legal case still pending? I'm sure you can't speak in any terms about it, but I wish you the best in all of that. And what was your friend's name, just so I can have remembrance of that? Ray. Okay, that's what I thought it was. I didn't want to misstate it. Hey, again, enjoyed talking to you. Maybe someday I'd pop back on here. But again, great talking with you, Shkreli. Is it pronounced Shkreli?
Yeah, you got it. Thank you, Cameron.
Okay, see you, Shkreli. I'm Cameron. Bye.
Have a good one.
You too.
Tennessee in the